The bus rumbled to a halt, its brakes hissing as Aurora stepped onto the familiar cracked pavement of her hometown's station. The air was different here, cleaner but weighted, heavy with the scent of pine and faintly damp earth. It hit her immediately, a sharp inhale pulling her back years to summer mornings spent riding bikes through dew-slick fields. She adjusted her blazer over her shoulders and tightened her grip on the sleek leather tote dangling from her wrist. She always felt a little overdressed here, like a misplaced piece of the city polished and sharp against the weathered edges of this rural canvas. Aurora's heels clicked against the uneven sidewalk as she walked toward the street, her pace brisk and purposeful, though no one was rushing here. She knew that. The sleepy familiarity of the town wrapped around her like an old sweater, warm but ill-fitting. Cedar Creek hadn't changed much in the years since she left. Same worn brick buildings, same hand-painted signs above the bakery and hardware store, same ancient oak trees lining the main road like silent sentinels. Yet, to her, it felt entirely foreign. She had spent years avoiding this place, burying herself in the frantic hum of the city. Its energy had been her escape, its noise her armor. But now, standing on this old street with her childhood just a breath away, Aurora felt her carefully constructed walls tremble. Her phone buzzed in her bag, a sharp reminder of the life waiting for her back in Chicago. A string of emails flashed across the screen, urgent and pressing. She sighed, pushing the phone deep into her bag. For once, she didn't have time to deal with deadlines or boardroom politics. It wasn't that kind of weekend, the family reunion. The words alone made her stomach tighten. It wasn't that she didn't love her family. She did, fiercely, but her career had demanded distance. She'd missed weddings, christenings, even the occasional holiday dinner. And now, as she prepared to spend the next 2 days surrounded by relatives, dozens of them, Aurora wondered if they'd see through her polished persona. Would they notice the cracks, the quiet exhaustion that city life had etched into her? She reached the corner where the old library stood, its stone facade dappled with sunlight filtering through the trees. As a kid, she'd spent hours inside, curled up with a book while her parents ran errands. She paused, her fingers grazing the wrought iron railing. The memory came unbidden, Liam daring her to climb the massive oak out back, her heart pounding with the thrill of risk. She could almost see them there, 2 gangly kids in their scuffed sneakers, laughing like they had all the time in the world. But time hadn't waited for her, and neither had Liam. She hadn't allowed herself to think of him in years. Yet here, surrounded by the familiar landmarks of their shared history, his ghost lingered. Shaking her head, Aurora straightened her spine and walked on, her heels clicking louder now as she approached the car her aunt had sent to pick her up. The reunion was at the art museum on the edge of town, a place she hadn't been to since high school, back when life had felt wide open and uncertain in a way that was thrilling rather than terrifying. Sliding into the passenger seat, Aurora caught her reflection in the window, composed, professional, self-assured, a woman who didn't belong in this town anymore. And yet, beneath the flawless facade, she felt the echoes of a girl who had once called this place home. The art museum loomed ahead, its grand limestone facade glowing in the late afternoon sun. Aurora stepped out of the car, smoothing the hem of her blazer, as her aunt, Judy, fussed with her purse on the driver's side. The museum, with its sprawling gardens and towering glass atrium, had always felt like an oddity in Cedar Creek, a treasure chest tucked into the small town's otherwise unassuming atmosphere. She supposed it made sense for the reunion to be here. Her family had a long history of supporting the arts, dating back generations to her great-grandfather, who had once donated a collection of rare prints to the museum. It was an extension of them, in a way, history and pride and a touch of grandeur, all wrapped into one. "Aurora, honey, you look so grown up," Aunt Judy gushed, finally rounding the car and holding her arms out. She smelled like lavender and peppermint, the same as always, and Aurora let herself lean into the hug even as the usual pang of guilt snuck in. "Your mother would be so proud to see you like this. Really, so proud." "Thanks, Aunt Judy. It's good to see you." Aurora pulled back with a smile that she hoped seemed effortless. "It's been too long." "Too long is right. Everyone's been asking about you inside. You're still the talk of the family, you know." Judy winked. Corporate lawyer, big city, our little Aurora making her mark. Aurora nodded politely, her grip tightening on her tote bag. It wasn't the first time she'd heard those words, and she doubted it would be the last. She followed Judy up the museum's wide stone steps, glancing at the familiar carvings etched into the pillars. The last time she'd been here was her senior year of high school, for a class trip. She and Liam had spent most of the day sneaking off to explore the lesser-used wings, whispering jokes about the overly serious portraits on the walls. Liam. Why did her mind keep circling back to him? The doors opened with a rush of cool air, and Aurora stepped into the atrium. The sound of chatter and laughter echoed off the high ceilings, and for a moment she paused to take it all in. Her family was everywhere. Clusters of cousins and uncles leaned against marble pedestals or wandered through the open gallery spaces. Children darted between the legs of grandparents, their giggles blending into the hum of conversation. It was loud and chaotic, unmistakably her family. Aurora barely had a chance to take a breath before she was spotted. There she is! Aunt Clara's voice rang out, high and clear, drawing every nearby gaze in her direction. Aurora braced herself as her aunt enveloped her in a hug that smelled faintly of Chanel No. 5. Look at you, all polished and professional. You're just as stunning as the last time I saw you. Oh, but that was, 2 years ago at Melinda's wedding? Far too long. Aurora laughed lightly, extracting herself with as much grace as she could manage. It's good to see you, Aunt Clara. And here's Uncle Ray. Clara gestured broadly as a man in a plaid shirt and suspenders approached with a booming laugh. Uncle Ray's hugs were just as firm as she remembered, and he wasted no time peppering her with questions about her job, the city, and when she planned to finally settle down. Aurora fielded the questions as deftly as she could, slipping into the polished rhythm she used in courtrooms and networking events. She smiled, nodded, and laughed in all the right places, but she couldn't shake the faint hum of disconnection. These were her people, her roots, and yet she felt like a visitor, an outsider stepping into a world she couldn't quite fit back into. As the crowd around her grew, so did the questions. Cousins she hadn't spoken to in years asked about her cases. Great-aunts praised her fancy shoes and teased her about being too thin. Her father's younger sister, always blunt, asked if she'd finally found someone who could keep up with that big brain of yours. Through it all, Aurora smiled, even as her stomach tightened. She loved her family, but she couldn't help feeling like a showpiece, a shiny example of success to be admired from a distance, but fundamentally out of place among the warm, chaotic familiarity of Cedar Creek. She had worked so hard to build this life, to be this woman who could command a boardroom and navigate the city with ease. But here, surrounded by so many familiar faces, she felt that woman slipping, the edges of her polished exterior softening with every hug and every well-meaning comment. Eventually, she managed to slip away into the quieter wing of the museum. The air here was cooler, the noise of the reunion muffled by thick walls and heavy doors. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and turned a corner into a small gallery filled with landscapes. Needed a break, too, huh? Came a low voice from behind her. Aurora froze, her heart skipping. She knew that voice, steady, warm, a little rough around the edges. She turned slowly, and there he was, Liam. Standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his broad frame silhouetted against the light spilling in from the hall. His face was older, sharper, but the boy she'd known was still there, in the easy curve of his smile and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hum of the reunion faded into the background, leaving only the quiet weight of their shared history hanging between them. Liam, Aurora said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. The gallery was hushed, a calm retreat from the bustle of the reunion's main hall, and Aurora found herself grateful for the quiet. The landscapes on the walls were soft and familiar. Rolling hills, sun-dappled meadows, quiet streams. They reminded her of Cedar Creek in a way that made her chest ache, though she couldn't entirely say why. Maybe it was the simplicity, or the way they captured a kind of stillness that had long eluded her. Here, surrounded by the artful echoes of her hometown, she could finally breathe. She let her eyes wander to a painting of a dirt road winding through tall grass, the kind of road she used to bike with. Aurora. The deep voice came from behind her, low and familiar, and it stopped her cold. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. Liam. He stood just a few feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans, his posture relaxed, yet somehow brimming with that same quiet energy he'd always carried. The years between them hadn't erased the boy she remembered, though they'd certainly added layers. His broad shoulders filled out his button-up shirt, and his face, now framed by a neatly trimmed beard, was sharper, more defined. But his eyes, those warm, steady eyes, were exactly the same. "I thought that was you," he said, his lips curving into a small, tentative smile. He took a step closer, but not too close, as if testing the air between them. "I wasn't sure at first. You look different." Aurora blinked, her mind scrambling to catch up. She hadn't allowed herself to think about Liam in years, let alone prepare for what it might feel like to see him again. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, like a memory come to life. "Liam," she managed, her voice softer than she intended. "Hi." "Hi? That's all you've got?" His smile widened, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Hi." She let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "Sorry, you just caught me off guard. It's been a long time." "It has," he agreed, his gaze steady on her. "What, 10 years? Maybe more?" "Something like that," she said, her fingers tightening around the strap of her tote bag. She could feel the awkwardness settling between them, thick and palpable. But there was warmth, too, a familiarity that hadn't entirely faded, even after all these years. "You look good, Aurora," Liam said after a moment, his voice quiet but sincere. "I mean, not that you ever didn't, but you know what I mean." Aurora felt heat rise to her cheeks, a mix of flattery and self-consciousness. She glanced down at her blazer, smoothing it instinctively. "Thanks, you too." Her eyes flicked back to him, and she allowed herself a small smile. "I like the beard. It suits you." Liam chuckled, his hand brushing over his jaw. "Yeah, well, figured it was time to grow up a bit. Got tired of people asking if I was still in high school." She laughed softly, the sound surprising her. It felt natural, easy, like slipping into an old rhythm she hadn't realized she missed. "So," he said, leaning slightly against the doorway, his shoulders relaxed. "What brings you back to Cedar Creek? I thought the big city had claimed you for good." Aurora hesitated, unsure how to condense the whirlwind of emotions that had brought her here. "The reunion," she said finally, gesturing vaguely toward the main hall. "Family duty, I guess. It's been a while since I've seen everyone." "And how's that going for you?" he asked, his tone light but tinged with curiosity. She huffed out a small laugh. "Overwhelming? I forgot how intense my family can be." Liam grinned. "Yeah, I remember. Your Aunt Clara cornered me earlier and insisted I try her famous potato salad, told me it'd change my life." Aurora laughed again, the sound fuller this time. "That sounds about right. She's been trying to push that potato salad on everyone for years. I think it's her way of avoiding small talk." "Smart strategy," Liam said, his grin softening into a smile. "Though I think I prefer actual conversation." There it was, that unmistakable ease between them. Aurora felt it in the way his words settled into her, in the way her own guardedness seemed to loosen ever so slightly. But with the ease came the weight of everything unspoken. The years they'd spent apart, the choices that had led them down such different paths. "How about you?" she asked, shifting the focus. "What brings you here? I didn't think reunions were really your thing." "They're not," he admitted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "But my mom insisted, said it'd be good for me to socialize more, whatever that means." "And well," he shrugged, glancing around the gallery. "I figured it wouldn't hurt to stop by. Didn't expect to run into you, though." Yeah," Aurora said, her voice quieter now. "I didn't expect to see you either." For a moment, they just looked at each other, the silence stretching but not uncomfortable. The hum of distant voices from the main hall was faint, almost like white noise, and Aurora found herself acutely aware of the weight of Liam's gaze, steady and searching. "It's good to see you," he said finally, his voice low and earnest. She felt the words settle in her chest, warm and unexpected. "You too," she said, her lips curving into a small but genuine smile. Liam shifted, glancing toward the hallway behind him. "I should probably get back before my mom starts wondering if I've snuck out." Aurora nodded, though she couldn't quite suppress the pang of disappointment. "Yeah, I should probably head back too, My family's probably wondering where I disappeared to." He hesitated, like he wanted to say something more, but instead he just smiled. "Maybe I'll see you around?" "Maybe," she said, her voice softer now. And with that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing faintly down the hall. Aurora stood there for a moment longer, her heart still beating a little faster than usual. She wasn't sure what she felt. Nostalgia? Relief? Something else entirely? But as she turned back to the painting of the dirt road, her gaze lingered on it a little longer, the ache in her chest softening into something almost sweet. The hum of chatter in the museum's atrium was suddenly pierced by the sharp crackle of the PA system. Aurora, who had just returned to the main hall, froze mid-step as a calm but authoritative voice filled the space. "Attention, guests. As a precautionary measure, we are initiating a temporary lockdown. Please remain where you are. Museum staff will provide further instructions shortly." The announcement seemed to suck all the air out of the room. A hush fell over the crowd, but it only lasted a moment before it fractured into scattered murmurs. People glanced at one another, some with confusion, others with worry, as the energy of the room shifted from celebration to unease. "A lockdown?" Aunt Clara's voice rang out from behind Aurora, her hands clutching her pearl necklace. "What on earth is going on?" Aurora scanned the room, her legal mind already racing to piece together what little information they'd been given. She spotted a small cluster of uniformed museum staff gathered near one of the side entrances, their furrowed brows and tense postures betraying the calm tone of the announcement. Something wasn't right. "Everyone, please stay calm," the PA voice reiterated, though the growing restlessness among the guests suggested that calm was becoming harder to maintain. Aurora made her way toward her aunt. "It's probably nothing," she said, keeping her voice measured. "These things are usually precautionary." But as she spoke, her eyes darted to one corner of the atrium where two security guards were motioning for a group to back away from a bench. On the floor beneath it sat a plain, nondescript duffel bag. Aurora's stomach tightened, a suspicious package. She felt her pulse quicken as the realization settled in, but she forced herself to stay composed. Panicking wouldn't help anyone. Around her, the crowd was growing louder, the hum of murmurs threatening to spill into something harder to contain. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of the guards called, stepping forward. He raised his hands in a calming gesture. "We understand this situation is unexpected, but we ask that you remain where you are. Please do not attempt to leave or approach restricted areas until further notice." "Until further notice?" Uncle Ray muttered, his brows knitting together. "What are we supposed to do? Just stand around and wait?" A child's wail cut through the air, sending a ripple of unease through the group. Aurora turned toward the sound, spotting a young girl clinging to her mother's leg, tears streaming down her cheeks. It was then that Aurora's instincts kicked in. She wasn't just going to stand around waiting for someone else to take control. She could do something. "Excuse me," she said, stepping toward the nearest guard. "I'm Aurora Hale. I have experience managing high-pressure situations. Legal consultant, corporate crisis management." She spoke quickly but clearly, her voice steady. "People are getting restless, and if we don't organize them, we could have a bigger problem than the one you're already dealing with." The guard hesitated, clearly weighing her offer against whatever protocol he'd been trained to follow. Before he could respond, a voice came from behind her. "She's right." Aurora turned to see Liam approaching, his expression calm but alert. "You need someone to keep people occupied and calm while you do your job. Let us help." The guard glanced between them, then gave a short nod. "Fine, but stay out of restricted areas." Aurora nodded, turning back to the crowd. She raised her hands for attention, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she stepped onto a small platform near the center of the room. "Everyone, listen up," she called, her voice slicing cleanly through the noise. The chatter quieted as heads turned toward her, curiosity and worry etched on their faces. "First and foremost, let's all take a breath," Aurora said, her tone firm but reassuring. "The museum staff are handling the situation, and we're going to cooperate to make sure everyone stays safe. That means staying calm and staying together." She gestured to the children scattered throughout the crowd. "If you've got kids with you, Let's move them toward the center of the room so they're not near any of the exits. Parents, stay with them. A few people began to move, the shift in focus helping to diffuse some of the tension. Aurora caught Liam's eye, and he gave her a small nod of encouragement before stepping in to assist. Everyone else, let's form smaller groups, Aurora continued. Stick with your family or friends, it'll make it easier to account for everyone. She moved through the crowd as she spoke, her presence grounding those around her. Liam followed, his steady demeanor helping to reinforce the sense of order she was trying to create. Smart thinking, he said quietly as they paused near a group of older relatives who were huddled together. You've got a knack for this. Aurora glanced at him, a flicker of warmth breaking through her focus. It's just about keeping people calm. I deal with high-strung CEOs all the time. Families aren't that different. Liam chuckled, the sound soft but reassuring. Maybe, but not everyone would step up like this. There was no time to dwell on his words, though, as the guard's voice cut through the room again. We'll be issuing updates as we assess the situation. Thank you for your cooperation. Aurora gave Liam a quick nod, her resolve hardening. Whatever was happening, she wasn't about to let fear take over. Not for herself and not for the people around her. The tension in the museum had thickened, the air humming with unease as guests murmured in low voices and clung to their loved ones. Aurora stood near the edge of the atrium, her quick thinking having calmed most of the crowd, but an undercurrent of restlessness remained. She glanced toward the guards near the suspicious duffel bag, their stiff postures and clipped conversations making it clear that the situation wasn't close to being resolved. Liam appeared at her side, moving with a quiet confidence that immediately steadied her. We need to get people out of here, he said, his voice low but firm. If that thing is dangerous, we can't risk waiting around. Aurora met his gaze, the steady brown of his eyes grounding her amidst the chaos. The guards said to stay put, she began, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew he was right. The rising energy in the room, the children clinging to their parents, the elderly relatives shifting uncomfortably. It was becoming a powder keg waiting for a spark. Yeah, and they're doing their best, but there are too many of us here, Liam said, gesturing subtly toward the clusters of people filling the atrium. If something happens, it'll be chaos trying to get everyone out at once. Aurora hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Her instincts had already been pushing her toward action, and Liam's calm resolve gave her the extra push she needed. Okay, she said, her voice steadying. There's no way out through the main doors, but this is an old building. There are service corridors, emergency exits, alternate routes we can use. Liam's brow lifted, a glimmer of surprise and admiration flickering across his face. You know this place that well? I've been here before. School trips, family visits, Aurora said quickly, already scanning the edges of the atrium for the entrances she knew were there. And I've studied enough floor plans for work to recognize how these places are laid out. His lips quirked into a faint smile. Always prepared, huh? She rolled her eyes, the tension between them easing for just a moment before snapping back into focus. Come on, let's split up and start gathering smaller groups. We'll guide them to the exits in shifts. Liam nodded, already stepping toward a cluster of nervous relatives. On it. Aurora moved in the opposite direction, her heels clicking briskly on the polished floor. She found her Aunt Judy with a group of older family members near the far wall. Aunt Judy, she said, her voice calm but firm. We're going to get everyone out of here. There's another way out of the building, but I need you to help keep the others calm while we move. Judy's eyes widened, but she nodded quickly, taking Aurora's hand in her own. Of course, sweetheart. Just tell me what to do. Aurora gave her a quick squeeze before moving on, addressing others in the group with the same measured tone. As she worked, she caught glimpses of Liam on the other side of the room, his broad presence commanding attention as he organized another group. He moved with the same quiet ease she remembered from their childhood, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the growing tension around them. When their paths crossed again, they had each gathered a small group of family members. Aurora quickly explained her plan, pointing toward the far corner of the room where a discreet door led to a service corridor. That door should connect to a hallway that runs alongside the gallery. If we follow it, we can circle around to the emergency exits without crossing through the atrium. Liam nodded, his gaze sweeping the group of nervous faces behind them. You take the first group. I'll stay here and bring the next one once you're clear. Aurora hesitated. Are you sure? You might need help if things get worse. He gave her a small but reassuring smile. I can handle it. Besides, you're better with directions. I'd probably get us all lost. Despite the gravity of the situation, Aurora couldn't suppress a soft huff of laughter. All right, she said, her voice softening. Just be careful. You too, he replied. With a quick nod, Aurora turned to her group and gestured for them to follow. She pushed open the door to the corridor, the cool, dimly lit space, a stark contrast to the bright opulence of the atrium. Her heels echoed softly against the concrete floor as she led the group forward, her pulse thrumming with a mix of focus and adrenaline. Everything's going to be fine, she assured a young boy clutching his mother's hand. We're just taking a little detour. The boy blinked up at her, his wide eyes reflecting both fear and trust. Aurora smiled at him, and when he offered a hesitant one in return, she felt a flicker of something warm break through the tension in her chest. The corridor twisted and turned, but Aurora navigated it with ease, the route coming back to her as if muscle memory had taken over. When they reached the emergency exit, she held the door open, directing her group outside into the cool evening air. Once everyone was safely out, she turned back, her mind already on Liam and the others still inside. She retraced her steps quickly, her heart pounding harder as she neared the atrium. When she emerged back into the room, Liam was there, standing near his group with the same calm focus she'd seen earlier. His eyes flicked to her, and she gave him a quick nod. Your turn, she said. He stepped forward, ushering his group toward the corridor with a quiet authority that put everyone at ease. Aurora stayed behind this time, positioning herself near the remaining relatives. She scanned the room, her legal mind cataloging every detail. The guards, the duffel bag, the exits, while also keeping an ear out for Liam's return. Minutes later, he was back, his expression still steady but his pace quickening. They're out, he said, stepping up beside her. Now let's finish this. Together, they moved the last group, their steps perfectly in sync as they guided the remaining family members through the corridor. It wasn't until the last relative was safely outside, standing among a crowd of confused but relieved guests, that Aurora finally let herself breathe. She and Liam stood side by side, their shoulders brushing as they watched the scene unfold. The hum of worried conversations filled the air, but for a moment, it felt like the two of them were in their own quiet bubble. You did good in there, Liam said, his voice low but warm. Aurora glanced up at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. We did good, she corrected. He met her gaze, his eyes crinkling with that familiar warmth, and for the first time in years, Aurora felt like she truly belonged. The narrow service corridor was quieter now, the echoes of Aurora's heels softened by the hum of the small group following behind her. The museum's sterile fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead, illuminating the faded green paint that lined the walls. Liam walked beside her, a flashlight he'd found in one of the utility closets casting a steady beam ahead of them. Their footsteps fell into rhythm, his heavier boots grounding the light click of her shoes. You always did have a knack for taking charge, Liam said, his voice low enough not to carry to the others. There was a trace of amusement in his tone, like he'd been waiting for the right moment to say it. It's been what? 20 minutes since everything went sideways, and you've already got our families practically marching in formation. Aurora glanced at him, her lips quirking into a small smile. Well, someone has to keep things from falling apart. I'm just glad you decided to tag along. You're surprisingly good at crowd control. Surprisingly? He arched a brow, the flashlight beam bobbing as he gestured with it. I'll have you know I wrangle roofing crews all the time. Picture a bunch of grown men arguing over measurements in 90-degree heat. This is child's play compared to that. She laughed softly, the sound easing the tension in her chest for a moment. All right, fair point, but I was half expecting you to duck out and let the museum staff handle it. Nah, he said, his voice dipping into something quieter. I couldn't leave you to handle all this on your own. Besides, I figured you'd need someone to hold a flashlight. Aurora shook her head, a faint laugh slipping out again. Nice to know my childhood partner in crime hasn't lost his chivalry. Some things don't change, Liam said with a grin. Speaking of, you still get that little crease between your eyebrows when you're concentrating. Saw it earlier when you were giving orders back there. Her brow furrowed instinctively, and she gave him a mock glare. I do not. You do, he teased, his grin widening. Used to show up all the time back when we'd try to fix your dad's old bike. Remember that? The chain kept popping off, and you insisted you could fix it without any help. Aurora couldn't hold back her smile this time, the memory rising to the surface unbidden. I remember you standing there laughing while I got grease all over my hands. Some help you were. In my defense, I did eventually step in and fix it, he countered, his tone light. After you gave up and threatened to throw the whole thing in the creek. She laughed, the sound carrying softly through the corridor. Okay, fine, you saved the bike. I'll give you that. They walked in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history settling between them like a warm blanket. Aurora glanced back at the group trailing behind them, reassured by the sight of her Aunt Judy whispering quietly to one of the younger cousins. She turned her attention back to Liam, her curiosity tugging her forward. So, you're still working with your family's business? She asked, genuinely curious. The roofing company? Yep, he said, his voice steady. Still climbing ladders and patching leaks. It's not exactly glamorous, but it's honest work. Keeps me connected to Cedar Creek, you know? She nodded, her gaze softening. I always admired that about you. You've never needed anything flashy to make you happy. He chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. Well, I wouldn't say no to a newer truck, but yeah, Cedar Creek's home. It's where my family is, where my friends are. I like knowing I'm helping take care of the place. Aurora studied him for a moment, the ease in his posture, the quiet pride in his voice. It was such a stark contrast to her own restless ambition, the constant drive to climb higher and prove herself. Do you ever, wonder what it'd be like to leave? To see what else is out there? Liam tilted his head, considering her question. Sometimes, he admitted, but then I think about what I'd be leaving behind. My folks, the guys at work, the little things like Friday nights at the diner or fixing a neighbor's porch. It's not big or exciting, but it's enough for me. His words settled in her chest, heavy and warm, all at once. She looked away, focusing on the path ahead. I guess I've always been the opposite, she said quietly. I couldn't wait to leave. I wanted more, I guess. The city, the lights, the rush of it all. I thought if I could just get out, I'd finally feel like I was enough. Liam's step slowed slightly, and she felt his gaze on her. And do you? Aurora blinked, her throat tightening unexpectedly. She turned to him, her expression wavering between honesty and deflection. I don't know. Some days, yes. Other days. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Other days, I wake up and wonder if I've traded too much to get here. Liam didn't respond right away, but his silence wasn't empty. It carried the weight of understanding, the kind that didn't need words to fill the gaps. Finally, he said, You've always been enough, Aurora. You didn't need to prove that to anyone. She looked at him then, her chest tightening as his words settled deeper than she'd expected. Before she could think of how to respond, a voice called from behind them. Aurora, Liam, are we almost there? Aurora turned, her professional composure snapping back into place. Just a little further, she called, her voice steady. She glanced back at Liam, offering him a small, grateful smile before they continued forward, the moment slipping into the quiet hum of their footsteps once more. The makeshift group of relatives had settled near a quiet corner of the museum's garden, the tension of the evacuation replaced by hushed conversations and tired relief. Aurora paced near the edge of the group, her heels crunching softly on the gravel. Liam leaned against a low stone wall, arms crossed as he watched her with a mix of curiosity and amusement. You're going to wear a hole in the ground, he teased lightly. Aurora stopped mid-step, shooting him a quick glare. I can't help it. Something doesn't feel right. What? That we're all stuck out here waiting for answers? Liam asked, pushing off the wall to stand beside her. Yes, and She hesitated, her hand brushing the strap of her tote bag as if grounding herself. And the fact that no one's mentioned the artifact, Liam frowned. What artifact? Aurora glanced toward the rest of their family, ensuring no one was within earshot. The sculpture, she said in a low voice. My great-grandfather's bronze piece, the one he donated to the museum decades ago. It's a centerpiece of this place, part of the family's legacy. I noticed earlier it wasn't in its usual display case, and now with everything going on. You think it's missing? Liam's brows furrowed, his voice laced with concern. Aurora nodded. Or worse, no one said anything, but if that package was some kind of distraction? She trailed off, her jaw tightening. If someone's using the chaos to steal it, they're not getting away with it, Liam finished for her, his voice steady. She blinked, surprised by his immediate resolve. You're really okay with this? Running around after some old statue? He gave her a small, lopsided smile. It's not just some old statue, is it? It's part of your family, part of this town. If it matters to you, it matters to me. Aurora felt her chest tighten, her guard slipping just a fraction. Thank you, she said quietly. Then, with a practiced exhale, her focus sharpened. All right, if it's missing, whoever took it won't have had time to sneak it out yet. The museum's still locked down. Which means it's probably still inside, Liam said, already glancing toward the building like he was preparing for a fight. Aurora nodded. We need to figure out where it is, and fast. Liam's grin turned wry, but his eyes were serious. Lead the way, partner. The museum was eerily quiet as Aurora and Liam slipped back inside through a side door, the faint echoes of their footsteps magnified by the cavernous halls. The sound of distant voices from security staff faded as they moved deeper into the building, leaving only the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the old structure. Aurora's pulse thrummed in her ears, her senses sharpened by the weight of what they were attempting. Liam walked beside her, his flashlight cutting through the dimness. They had decided to avoid the main galleries, where staff and guests were still gathered, and instead ventured into the lesser-known areas of the museum, the corridors and storage rooms that had fascinated Aurora as a teenager, but now felt more like a labyrinth. The air here was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of metal and dust. They passed rows of unmarked doors, each one holding the potential for secrets. You're awfully quiet, Liam murmured, his voice low but steady. Aurora glanced at him. His jaw was set, his eyes scanning their surroundings with a sharper focus than she was used to seeing. She hesitated before answering. I'm just trying to piece this all together. If someone took the artifact, they wouldn't risk running through the main halls. They'd hide it somewhere first, wait until things calmed down. Liam's flashlight swept across the walls, pausing on a directory map mounted beside a heavy steel door. So you think they stashed it in one of these storage areas? It's possible. Aurora stepped closer to the map, her eyes narrowing as she studied it. The museum has a restoration wing, doesn't it? I remember seeing it on a tour when I was a kid. It's down this way, near the south wing. Liam shifted, peering over her shoulder. Makes sense. If I were trying to hide something, I'd pick a spot where it'd blend in, somewhere full of other old stuff that wouldn't stand out. Aurora smirked faintly. You're surprisingly good at thinking like a thief. He chuckled under his breath, his voice warm despite the seriousness of the situation. Guess all those mystery novels my mom used to read rubbed off on me. And hey, I've spent enough time fixing roofs to know how people hide things they don't want found. She shook her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips despite herself. Well, let's hope your skills come in handy. She turned toward the south wing, her stride purposeful but careful. Come on. They moved in silence for a while, the tension of the moment sharpening their focus. As they entered the south wing, the polished marble floors gave way to concrete, and the lighting dimmed further, the overhead bulbs spaced farther apart. The walls were lined with old shelves and racks, some draped in white sheets, that gave the space an almost ghostly quality. Aurora paused, running her hand lightly along a workbench where tools and brushes were neatly arranged. It's strange, she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. This place used to feel so magical to me, like a portal to another world. Now it just feels cold. Liam stopped beside her, his flashlight beam lingering on a painting leaning against a wall. its surface crackled with age. I get that, he said. When you're a kid, everything feels bigger, brighter, more alive. Then you grow up, and you start seeing what's underneath, what's broken, what's been patched up. It's not the same. Aurora glanced at him, surprised by the weight of his words. You sound like you've thought about this a lot. He shrugged, his lips quirking into a faint, self-deprecating smile. Maybe. I spend a lot of time fixing old roofs and patching up houses. Makes you think about how everything wears down eventually, but that doesn't mean it's not worth saving. Her chest tightened at the quiet conviction in his voice. You've always been like that, she said, her voice softer now. You see the value in things, in people, even when it's not obvious. Liam tilted his head, his gaze meeting hers in the dim light. That's not a bad thing, is it? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It's not. It's rare, actually. She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of the workbench. I think I've spent so much time running toward what's next, what's bigger, better, that I forgot how to just appreciate what's already here. Liam studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable but warm. Well, he said after a beat, his voice low, you're here now. The simplicity of his words caught her off guard, and for a moment, the tension in her chest softened. She opened her mouth to respond, but movement at the edge of her vision drew her attention. There, she whispered, pointing toward a shadowed corner. A large object sat partially obscured beneath a heavy tarp. Aurora's pulse quickened as she and Liam approached it, their footsteps careful and deliberate. Liam reached the tarp first, gripping the edge and glancing back at her before pulling it off with a smooth motion. Beneath it was a large bronze sculpture, its dark, polished surface glinting faintly in the light of Liam's flashlight. Aurora's breath caught as she recognized the piece immediately. Her great-grandfather's work, unmistakable in its intricate design. Found it, Liam said, his voice quiet but triumphant. Aurora stepped closer, her hand hovering just above the surface of the sculpture. Relief and anger coursed through her in equal measure. Whoever did this wasn't planning to leave it here for long, she said, her tone hardening. We need to let security know. Agreed, Liam said, but his eyes stayed on her, his gaze steady. You okay? Aurora nodded, though her chest still felt tight. Yeah, I hate that someone would try to take something so important. It's not just art, it's history. Family history. Liam touched her shoulder lightly, the warmth of his hand grounding her. We'll make sure it's safe, he said simply. For a moment, she let herself lean into his steadiness, drawing strength from his presence. Then she straightened, her resolve hardening. Let's go. Together they turned back toward the halls, the weight of the artifact, and their shared connection, settling between them. The sky had shifted into a muted lavender as the last threads of daylight faded from the garden. Aurora stood near the edge of the museum's lawn, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The soft murmur of their families carried from a distance, but she'd stepped away, needing space, needing air. Liam found her there, his steps quiet yet deliberate as he approached. You okay? He asked, his voice low, familiar. Aurora didn't turn to face him immediately. She kept her eyes on the horizon, a faint line where the town she'd left behind gave way to the forest she used to know so well. I don't know, she admitted, the words coming out quieter than she intended, as though they were meant for herself more than him. Liam didn't press. He waited, patient as ever, his presence steady beside her. I feel like I'm living two lives, she finally said, her voice tight. There's the life I built, the one I fought for in the city. And then there's this place, this history, all these people who know me as the girl I used to be, not the person I am now, and you. She trailed off, shaking her head as her arms tightened around herself. What about me? Liam asked softly, his voice curious but without judgment. Aurora hesitated, finally turning to look at him. He stood there, framed by the fading light, solid and sure in a way that made her chest ache. You're everything this place is, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Steady, grounded, all the things I'm not, and I can't help wondering if that means we're just too different. Liam's brows knit together, his expression thoughtful but calm. You think being different is a bad thing? No, she said quickly, her throat tightening. It's just, I don't know if it works. You belong here, Liam, and I I don't know where I belong anymore. I'm so used to fighting for everything, to proving myself in a world that moves so fast. And you're the opposite of all that. You don't need to fight to be seen, because you just are. He took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. Aurora, he said, his voice steady, warm. You don't have to choose between who you were and who you are now, and you don't have to keep fighting just to feel like you're enough. You already are. His words landed softly, but with weight, unraveling something tightly wound inside her. She looked away, trying to gather herself, but Liam's presence, his quiet certainty, made it harder to keep the walls intact. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Then let's figure it out together, he said simply. Aurora turned back to him, her breath catching at the calm resolve in his face. For a moment, she let herself believe him. The garden was quiet now, the chaos of the day having settled into a calm hum of conversation in the distance. Aurora sat on the edge of a weathered stone bench, her elbows resting on her knees, fingers loosely interlaced. The cool air nipped at her skin, but she didn't move to grab the blazer she'd discarded beside her. Her mind was too loud, filled with tangled thoughts of the museum, her family, and the ache of feeling caught between two worlds. Liam sat down beside her, close enough for their shoulders to brush. He didn't say anything at first, his presence steady, the way it always had been. A long moment passed before he spoke. You know, he said, his voice low, thoughtful, I used to think you had everything figured out. Even when we were kids, you always knew how to get us out of trouble, how to climb higher, run faster. You just knew where you were going. Aurora let out a quiet laugh, bitter around the edges. Yeah, well, I may have been running, but I don't think I ever really knew where I was headed. Liam tilted his head, studying her. Maybe. But you never stopped pushing forward. That takes guts, Aurora. Not everyone has that. She turned her head toward him, her eyes searching his face. And what about you? She asked softly. You act like staying here was the easy choice, but I know it wasn't. Not with everything you had to give up. Liam's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't answer. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. It wasn't easy, he admitted after a pause. There were times I wondered if I'd made the wrong call, if I'd just been afraid to leave, afraid of failing out there where no one knew me, where I couldn't just be the guy who fixes roofs and helps his neighbors. Here, I know who I am. Aurora's chest tightened. But doesn't it feel like giving up on something bigger? He turned to her then, his expression soft but resolute. Not everything worth having is out there, Aurora. Sometimes it's right in front of you. You just have to stop long enough to see it, and you've got this fire, this ambition that lights up everything you do. But you don't have to burn yourself out proving how strong you are. You already are. Her breath hitched, his words settling somewhere deep inside her. I don't know if I can ever stop running, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Then I'll keep pace with you, Liam said, his tone steady and sure, his eyes warm as they met hers. However far you go. The museum's south wing was dimly lit, a hushed stillness surrounding the rows of artifacts and half-finished restorations. Aurora's pulse quickened as she stood with Liam near the corner of the room, her eyes scanning the shelves stacked with carefully catalogued boxes and objects draped in protective coverings. Somewhere in here, hidden among layers of dust and history, was the missing sculpture. It has to be close, she murmured, her voice low but charged with determination. Whoever took it wouldn't have moved it far, not with the lockdown in place. Liam held the flashlight steady, its beam cutting through the shadows that stretched across the room. Agreed, they'd stash it somewhere they thought no one would look, somewhere it could blend in. Aurora nodded, her mind racing as she stepped toward the far wall, where larger objects were stored on wide metal shelves. Her fingers lightly grazed the edge of the nearest box, her focus sharpening. She had spent her career solving problems under pressure, piecing together puzzles when others panicked. But this wasn't just any problem. This was her family's history, her great-grandfather's legacy, and losing it simply wasn't an option. Liam moved with quiet precision on the other side of the room, lifting the edges of heavy tarps and sweeping the flashlight beam across forgotten corners. He worked methodically, his calm presence grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. "Over here," he called softly, his voice cutting through the silence. Aurora turned, watching as Liam knelt near a low shelf at the back of the room. The tarp he'd pulled aside revealed a bulky shape underneath, larger than the other objects in the area, and definitely out of place. Her heart leaped as she hurried to his side, lowering herself onto one knee beside him. Liam glanced at her, his expression steady, but laced with a flicker of excitement. "This looks promising." Together, they gripped the edges of the tarp and pulled it back in one smooth motion. Beneath it, the unmistakable bronze surface of her great-grandfather's sculpture gleamed faintly in the dim light. The intricate detailing of the piece, the flowing curves and sharp angles that gave it life, confirmed its identity immediately. Aurora let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "We found it," she said, her voice catching slightly. Relief coursed through her, mingling with a fierce pride that they'd managed to do this together. Liam sat back on his heels, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Told you we'd figure it out." She looked at him, her chest tightening at the warmth in his gaze. "I couldn't have done this without you," she admitted, the words quieter, heavier than she'd expected. "I wouldn't have even known where to start." "You didn't need me," he said softly, his smile widening just a bit. "But I'm glad I was here." Aurora reached out, her fingers brushing over the cool metal of the sculpture. "This piece, it's more than just art. It's a part of my family, a part of this town." She paused, glancing at him. "I didn't realize how much it meant to me until I almost lost it." Liam's expression softened, his eyes steady on hers. "Then it's a good thing we didn't lose it." They stayed like that for a moment, the artifact between them, the weight of what they'd accomplished, settling in. It wasn't just about recovering the sculpture. It was about the way they'd worked together, seamlessly blending their strengths to overcome the challenge. Aurora's sharp instincts, Liam's quiet determination, they'd each brought something the other couldn't. Finally, Aurora stood, brushing the dust from her knees. "We should get this back to the main gallery," she said, her voice steady but lighter now, more sure. Liam rose beside her, gripping one side of the sculpture as Aurora took the other. It was heavier than it looked, but the weight didn't feel burdensome. They carried it carefully, their steps in sync as they made their way through the winding halls of the museum. As they moved, Aurora felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This wasn't just about the sculpture. It was about finding something neither of them had realized they'd been missing. Trust, connection, and the realization that together, they were stronger than they could ever be apart. The moon hung low over the museum gardens, its silver light spilling across the quiet lawn where Aurora and Liam stood apart from the dwindling crowd of family members. The air was cool, layered with the scent of cedar and freshly turned earth, but neither of them seemed to notice. Aurora's arms were crossed loosely as she tilted her head back, staring up at the clear, star-strewn sky. Beside her, Liam shifted his weight, hands tucked into his pockets, his presence as steady as it had been all day. "So," he said softly, breaking the silence, "you're really heading back to the city tomorrow?" Aurora turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, back to the chaos, the deadlines, all of it." She paused, her lips curving into a faint smile. "But it feels different now, less like something I have to run toward and more like one part of something bigger." Liam's eyes softened, his gaze steady on hers. "The city doesn't have to pull you away from here. You know that, right? And Cedar Creek doesn't have to hold me back." His voice was quiet but sure, each word carrying the weight of their shared realizations. Aurora smiled, a warmth blooming in her chest. "What if we stopped worrying about where we belong and just built something new? Something that's ours?" Liam's face broke into that lopsided grin she'd missed for so long. "Sounds like a plan, partner." Their laughter echoed softly through the night, a sound full of promise.